the only real way that you could close the gap and make people's achievement on a par with one another is if you hold back the children, if you hold back the students who are ready at an earlier age to do different content.
They're lying to themselves if they say that, oh, it's not going to hurt gifted students. They know it will. They don't care. They don't care about the needs of exceptional individual students. All they care about is some aggregate statistics and about whether or not the policy meets their so-called equity standards.
Zohran Mamdani is the newly elected mayor of New York City, and he has big plans for shaking up education in the country's largest school district. He faced a firestorm a few weeks ago when he shared his plan to phase out New York City's Gifted and Talented program, starting by prohibiting new kindergartners from joining the program next school year. In its place, he wants to create a universal pre-K program, free for all children from birth to age 5. Welcome to the Ayn Rand Institute podcast. I'm Samantha Watkins, and with me is Ben Bayer. Hi, Ben. Thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Samantha.
So I want to start by giving a little bit of context on Gifted and Talented, and specifically Gifted and Talented in New York City, because New York City is a bit of an outlier across the country. Gifted and Talented programs are not that common. I think only around 6% of public school students are enrolled in a Gifted and Talented program. So New York is special that it has a program, and it has such an extensive program. There are about, I think, 5 actual dedicated gifted and program schools across the city. The program is popular, like far more people apply or are recommended by their teachers to join the Gifted and Talented program than there are spots. I think this last year there were 10,000 students who were either recommended or who applied for the entry in kindergarten for only 2,500 spots. New York describes the Gifted and Talented curriculum as accelerated, as more in-depth. It's the same basic standards that apply to all public schools, but it's at a faster pace. I don't have personal knowledge about the quality of the program. My general suspicion is it's nothing to write home about, just based on things that I generally see in kind of elite school programs. But the general public perception, especially of people in New York, is that these are high quality. People want their kids in these programs. And Mamdani, like the former mayor Bill de Blasio back in 2019, he wants to go back to that plan and phase out the Gifted and Talented program.
Yeah, Sam, I'm really glad that you picked this topic, especially right after Mamdani's was elected. There's been a lot of controversy, obviously, about Mamdani, about all the various proposals that he wants to enact, given that he is a so-called democratic socialist. I think the furor over him over his election is in many cases quite justified. But on the topic of education in particular, and I think maybe not everybody appreciates why this, of all the topics, is one to focus on. And part of the reason is that many of the proposals that Mamdani wants to enact are ones he wants to enact them, but there's not obvious reason to think he's going to succeed. He has to get them by city council. Will city council actually agree with him, et cetera? He doesn't have carte blanche to impose socialism over New York's economy, as some of his critics sometimes seem to assume. But he does have a kind of carte blanche over education policy, because New York, unlike other cities, the New York school district is actually directly governed by the office of the mayor, unlike in other cities. It's not a school board. It used to be a school board, but the New York State legislature took that power away from the New York City school board and gave it to the mayor. And so when we look at what kind of proposals he wants to enact on education, here we can expect he's actually going to get to have what he wants. And it's on these kind of policies where I think you really see the essence and the meaning of his socialism coming out. That's one of the things I want to talk about for sure today. And you mentioned, I think, rightly, some of the facts and situation about gifted education in New York. And the way you put it was, if you look at the way gifted education is generally practiced around the country, it's not exactly something to write home about. And I think that's right. I mean, my personal experience with gifted education is, if I'm going to criticize it, my criticism is going to be, it doesn't do nearly enough to serve the needs of students with greater ability. And as I think you were implying, when it's practiced, it's often done with a view toward treating gifted kids as kind of guinea pigs for the latest progressive education theories, and that's a real problem. And so, if critics of the current program cite studies showing that it's not very effective, that it doesn't really help them, I suspect that's probably the reason why. But this is not the reason Mamdani wants to get rid of them. I mean, that would be a reason to double down on more effective gifted programs. He has very different reasons for wanting to repeal the gifted program in New York, and we should definitely talk about that.
Yeah, so let's get into some of the reasons. So at least during the campaign, he's been pretty cryptic. He hasn't gone on a whole thing to talk about why he wants to get rid of it. But he has mentioned that he wants to follow the advice, the prescriptions of this school diversity advisory group. This group was created under former Mayor Bill de Blasio back when he was in office and when he was first proposing phasing out the gifted and talented program. And we can definitely look in detail at what they say the reasons would be for ending gifted and talented. And there are two big reasons. They name many, but the two big reasons that they name. One is that they think gifted and talented furthers or widens what they call the achievement gap. And the other has to do with gifted and talented creating a segregated school system. And so for the achievement gap, their reasoning is that often the students that qualify and end up in the gifted and talented program, they have families that are wealthy. And so their argument is they're not naturally gifted. They're not more intellectually capable than other children. They've just had a better early childhood experience because they've had more resources from their wealthier families. So it's not fair then to give them a gifted and talented program, an accelerated program that's going to just further that gap between where they're starting and the other children who don't have those resources are starting. So on the other one is segregation, and they have this goal they state in their document where they're talking about their prescriptions for education, where they say they believe all schools should represent the socioeconomic and racial diversity of the city as a whole. So if there are 10% Hispanics in New York City, then every school and every classroom should have 10%, should be represented by 10% of the students being Hispanic. And what you find in the gifted and talented program is that it's not representative of the city as a whole. Indeed, they'll come out and talk about how it's the reverse of what you'll see in the city. So whereas most of the city students are Black or Latino, fewer students are white and Asian. In the gifted and talented program, you see the reverse. Most of the students are white and Asian, fewer are Black and Latino. And they claim that this undermines their diversity goals and that this is, in effect, creating a segregated school system.
Well, the way you put it as in effect is an important qualification. I want to say something about their use of this term segregation in relation to this topic, because I think it's like the first tip of the hat that there's something quite disingenuous in this whole argument, the whole case, in this document you mentioned, which apparently Mamdani's on board with. So the School Diversity Advisory Group document. I read this document, and it begins by saying the New York City schools are, quote, as segregated as the schools of Mississippi and Alabama. Now, I suspect that's trying to conjure up associations with like the Jim Crow South. But of course, even the South isn't the Jim Crow South anymore. Could it be that the reason that New York is as segregated as Mississippi and Alabama is that neither of them is, because segregation is illegal even in Alabama and Mississippi? So they cite a study that does point to data from, I should mention, from the years 2013 to 2014, how more Black students in New York are in schools with minority number of whites than, for example, in Mississippi and Alabama. And I mean, that's a real fact, and you can't deny, I don't think, that that is a history. That is a result of history, of real segregationist policies and racist injustice. And even in a city like New York, like there were policies like redlining that in effect made it impossible for minorities to live in certain neighborhoods and forced them into others. And then there was white flight, which was a racist, social practice that resulted in the same kind of clustering of different people of different so-called racial groups in different schools. Those are real, but they're not actual segregation today. There are no actual segregationist policies in New York today whereby certain members of certain alleged groups are mandated to be in certain schools and not others. And it's just disingenuous to call that segregation. It's what they do argue, they go on to argue in this document that the reason there's this kind of clustering, they try to blame it on the very kind of academic policies that they now want to repeal. They try to blame it on selective school screening, and they even try to blame it more improbably on gifted and talented programs itself. Now, that last part is so wildly implausible because, as you mentioned, Samantha, there's such a small number of gifted programs and schools. We're talking about, 2,000 something students who are in these. I don't think that accounts for the massive clustering of different ethnic groups by school, especially since the data that they're drawing on goes back to 2013, 2014, well before the policies we're talking about had been implemented, at least to the degree that they are now trying to repeal them. It's a little bit more plausible that the screening for admission to certain New York schools, because New York has a kind of school choice program now, and has since the early 21st century. It's a little more plausible that that could account for some of the clustering if you reason that different so-called racial groups have different socioeconomic status, and that gives them different advantages in getting into these schools, in taking tests and preparing for them. Yes, that's a little more plausible, but then it's still disingenuous to call it segregation. If that's segregation, then so are standardized tests, where all the same kind of socioeconomic factors explain disparities in testing scores. And you might think that that's an unfortunate consequence of a history of racism, but it's not segregation itself. And it's just bizarre to say that it is. And it's especially bizarre to say it in the same breath as realizing that there's a disproportionate number of Asian students in these programs. If it's segregation, it's a strange kind of allegedly white supremacist segregation. So, of course, the real criticism at the end of the day is not that it's really segregation, but that the admissions system for these schools is not using the kind of quote unquote equity standards that they want them to use. And the big question is, what do they mean by that? And how do they hope to change it?
Yeah, so one clue or one other aspect of this whole issue in education for Mamdani is his counter proposal for ending gifted and talented. So in the interviews that he's given where he's been asked, okay, you're going to end gifted and talented, then what? Like what is your plan? Well, he shifts his focus completely and he says, what I want to do is I want to have universal pre-K. So we're going to completely drop the context of how poorly perhaps some of the struggling K-12 schools are doing in New York. And his focus, his most important proposal he's named, we'll see now that he's been elected if it pans out to be his most important, is universal childcare for children birth to 5 years old. And, he pitches it in part as a way to make, living in New York City as a family more affordable. Many families can afford childcare. Childcare is quite expensive. But I think if we view it in the context of ending gifted and talented and this whole way of thinking about wealthier families are giving their children unfair advantages by preparing them for kindergarten in ways that other families don't have the resources for. Part of the idea of having a universal pre-K childcare program is to try and lift up the struggling students or the students who aren't as wealthy, so that they can start kindergarten on the same footing, so they can close that or, weaken that achievement gap that they talk about. And, I think it's really a fantasy that we can lift children up and close the achievement gap. I mean, certainly it's true that if you're taking a child who is not getting well supported in early childhood, who maybe is not getting any support educationally in early childhood, and you actually give them quality developmental support, like they will be doing better. And that would be a good thing. But it's not true that in doing that, you are closing or could close the achievement gap. If every child is getting a good quality early childhood education, it's very possible that you could be increasing the variance. I mean, in my own experience, observing and working with Montessori schools, this is what we see. Montessori, is a highly individualized program within a very standard curriculum, scope and sequence. And what we see is that when children have the individual support that they need, they advance at wildly disparate rates. Some kids, they're ready to read at 2 years old. A lot of others are not ready at that age, and you couldn't force them to be ready. You couldn't lift them up to be ready to read as early as some of the children who are able to do it that early. Similarly in all the other subjects. And so it's a fantasy to think that you can lift up and close the gap. And it's part of the reason why thinking about closing the gap is a corrupt goal in the first place. The only real way that you could close the gap and make people's achievement on a par with one another is if you hold back the children, if you hold back the students who are ready at an earlier age to do different content. So it'd be the child who's ready to read it too. You just don't teach him to read it too. You hold him back and make him be at the same level as the other children. Or if you have a 4-year-old who's ready to do mental math, it means holding him back. It's the only way to make sure you close that gap. And then part of what is the context that is dropped in this whole conversation. Mamdani is proposing essentially to extend public education down to birth. And what are the grounds that New York City or that the government in general can be trusted to bring in quality early childhood education to everyone? I mean, they're certainly not doing it in K-12. I mean, in New York in particular, if you look at the data, it's 70+% of 8th graders can't read at grade level, can't do math at grade level. And you're going to have the gall to say, we can give you a quality early childhood education. We can take your baby and your toddler and prepare them for kindergarten when we can't even help your kindergartners go to first grade. Like the gall to vie for that kind of power when there are no grounds for us to trust New York City's government or the public school system at all to be able to handle that.
Yeah, it's extraordinarily galling, and I think there's a connection between the last 2 points you made. The one about how concern for equity, you can only really implement equity by dragging the more able people down, and the point about the expansion of government control. They're connected because it's that expansion of government control into pre-K that's going to drag people down. Because you've mentioned, I think rightly, that just generally speaking, public education has such a bad history of unreliability. Right now, you've got mostly free market in pre-K. And then, but soon it will turn into more of a government monopoly. They won't outlaw, private pre-K, but by virtue of the fact that the government is going to start paying for it for anybody who wants it, it's going to have the effect of driving a lot of the current private pre-K companies out of business. Because they're just not going to be able to compete with this new government monopoly. Some of the parents who are currently paying for the private companies will just decide they don't want to have to pay. They'll move into the public version of it. Some will have to leave because they can't afford it anymore. Because when these private companies can't compete, some of them will go out of business. That will drive down the supply. That will drive up the price. And so you'll have more people being forced into public pre-K, and what I strongly suspect is it will become public daycare, not actually pre-K education. Most people don't appreciate there's a real educational dimension to what we call pre-K. This is what Montessori philosophy is all about. It's all about the idea education begins basically when you're in the crib, and Montessori programs are focusing on developing the child's mind, from day one, basically. And you know, when government takes over pre-K, it's going to become glorified babysitting. They're not going to be able to get the kinds of people who have the training to think of this from an educational approach. And yes, that's going to drag down a lot of people, a lot of kids who otherwise would have been able to start with private pre-K, but now will be at the disadvantage of just going to babysitting.
Right. And so part of what you're saying is that the private industry will kind of be shrunk because it'd be hard to compete with free. And for some people that might seem theoretical, but it's already happening in areas that have free kindergarten or free pre-K programs. Like I went on a tour at a Montessori school yesterday, and in their children's house, which is usually for children 3 to 6 years old, I was asking them, like, what is the actual ages that you have in the classroom? And they're like, well, it's really mostly 3-year-olds because in our area, young fives and pre-K is free through the public school system. And so parents do choose to leave, in fact, now when free is offered for preschool and for kindergarten.
I mean, it's already happening in all of public education. It's why around most of the country where there's free K through 12, private schools are generally very difficult to afford.
Yeah. So I want to turn to kind of the meaning of this proposal. What is it that they're actually achieving and actually what they're on about with these equity goals? My view is that, they're focusing on ending gifted and talented. They're putting a lot of focus and energy on this small program, one program allegedly that is good in New York City. And they're wanting to end it. They're wanting to get rid of it. And there's no discernible benefit to the students allegedly that they care about, that they want to help. It's not going to raise up the quality of the general education. And to me, what this means is that it's about punishing the kids who are ahead. They don't like that some kids are ahead. They don't like that they tend to come from wealthier families, or they come from racial groups that they don't like as much, and they want to punish them. Because in the end, what it means is they end gifted and talented. As if they phase it out, it means that these children who, for whatever reason, they're starting kindergarten at a higher level, they're ahead of their peers, they're going to be put in a general education classroom and forced to go at the pace and at the level of the rest of the kids in the classroom. They're going to be bored out of their minds. They're going to be prevented from moving ahead of the group. And this is really disastrous for these kids who are ahead. I mean, I know kindergartners. I know a kindergartner who's 5 years old. She can already read chapter books. Like, not so long ago, she was reading Roald Dahl's The Big Friendly Giant. That is not a normal thing for a 5-year-old to be able to do. And if she were, prevented from getting to go at her pace, prevented from being challenged, as these ending gifted and talented would do to children like her, she'd be forced to sit in a kindergarten classroom with children who've not even been introduced to the alphabet. They're going to spend 2 weeks learning the letter A, and she's going to be sitting there bored out of her mind. And that's cruel. It is punishing her for no good reason. And as I mentioned, none of this even helps the children who are behind. If anything, it makes the teacher's job harder, because in the conventional approach to education, you have, the premise is that you have to push everybody through at the same pace. But now you have children who are wildly ahead and who are wildly behind one another, and you're supposed to teach them all at the same rate. And it's just a recipe for a disaster for everyone.
Yeah, I want to really support what you're saying by way of answering an objection to it. I think someone listening could say, well, what do you mean? I get that you don't like this policy, but what do you mean when you say it's so ill-intentioned? I mean, is it really the case that Mamdani is sitting in a dark room somewhere, twirling his mustache, saying, oh, I want to punish these students? And I doubt that he's doing that. But there is a point to talking about somebody's motive and intention beyond the actual explicit statements they make to themselves, especially when the result you're talking about is a totally predictable effect. And no matter what they are actually saying to themselves or what they're telling their supporters, those rationalizations can't erase the fact that they know that these are the effects, and they're doing it in spite of that knowledge. And I think a really good sign of this is, so you mentioned the school diversity advisory group and the document they published. If you read that document, they end up using what I think is, in effect, a fig leaf to try to convince themselves and others that this is not going to be the effect. And here I'll quote one passage from that document where they say, a number of studies have shown that mixed ability classrooms, which cater to the needs of both general education students and advanced students, are beneficial to students with lower proficiency levels and do not harm students learning above proficiency level. And that last part about do not harming students above proficiency level, that's the attempt to say, no, the problem that you've just raised, Samantha, is not a real one. So how do they show us that they do not harm students learning above proficiency levels, especially in light of the fact that I think we all know that people of higher ability, when they are stuck in a mainstream class, find it slow, unchallenging, boring, etc., in just the way that you described, and that is a form of harm. It's a form of, in effect, cognitive torture. And these people could be doing so much more with their minds, but they're in effect being held back. So why is that kind of common sense point not true according to this document? What did the studies that they cite actually show? Well, I like to dig into research, and so I actually dug into their footnotes to see what the studies that they cite actually say. And well, it's probably not giving things away to say they don't say a damn thing like what they claim they say. So one of them is just a kind of pseudo-philosophical argument for why giftedness is a social construct. It's not a study at all. It's a tract using kind of nonsense of Foucauldian postmodernist language. That's not even a study. Another talks about when it deigns to even discuss the issue of the experience of gifted students. The only issue it focuses on is their allegation that those who are put into gifted programs allegedly feel humiliated by the fact that they are separated. It doesn't quantify this. There hasn't been a survey of how many of them feel humiliated, whether it's the majority even or just a few that they happen to have cherry-picked. And certainly doesn't even bother to look at the effects on the students who aren't separated, the ones where there aren't gifted programs, where they are stuck in the mainstream classroom. It doesn't even look at what the effects are on them. The closest that any of the studies that they give come to addressing this issue is a couple of the articles that are listed talk about a case study of I think it was Rockville, New York, where they decided to put everyone in a district into an accelerated math program. And the result that they find is that, well, more people passed the math achievement test once they'd all been challenged than passed it before. I mean, that seems like a good reason to challenge more students with harder math classes. It doesn't sound like a reason to not do any kind of a separation between students of different abilities, especially since the study, once again, doesn't at all speak to the question of what was the experience of those students who were still having to learn admittedly accelerated material with less accelerated people. It just doesn't address it. So none of the studies address the obvious point that students in this kind of situation are in one way or another harmed. And to say that the studies show it is just a complete joke. If they really cared about gifted children, maybe what they should be doing instead is trying to grow the gifted program to find more gifted kids, perhaps even in the underserved populations. And at one point, New York did this. New York tried to expand its gifted program. Nobody signed up for it, is what the diversity advisor group even says. But rather than looking for ways to recruit more of them or explain to them why it's beneficial, they just want to roll it back entirely. And what I think this points to is this whole thing was a fig leaf. They're lying to themselves if they say that, oh, it's not going to hurt gifted students. they know it will. They don't care. They don't care about the needs of exceptional individual students. All they care about is some aggregate statistics and about whether or not the policy meets their so-called equity standards. And at the end of the day, you're right, Samantha, the only way to actually meet those standards is to hurt the people, the individual students of greater ability, regardless of their background. And here I want to really stress that part of the reason this is such an important issue to talk about is if you want to condemn Mamdani's socialism, which I think you should want to condemn, this cuts to the essence of what is so evil about socialism. What's evil about socialism is not that it wants to bring prosperity and wealth to the masses, because it doesn't. It doesn't really want to. It is not about lifting up the needy. It is about dragging down those with abilities. You can't even try to lift up the needy in a kind of socialist system without burdening the able, especially when the actual aim is to tear them down. And the reason for this is that this is what, at heart, socialism is motivated by. It's motivated by the morality of altruism, which is not the morality of benevolence and generosity. It is the morality that celebrates and cherishes self-sacrifice, the idea that there's virtue in giving up. And what this socialist policy Mamdani is now proposing for New York is to ask parents with children of ability to give up the opportunities they would have otherwise had through these gifted programs, and it's asking those children to give them up. And that is what is just so nihilistic and awful about this program and about socialism generally.
Yeah, and I think part of the way you can tell that this meaning is coming through clearly, even if they're not going to state it explicitly, is the response that that Mamdani and his supporters have received, even from people on the left. So the left, for the most part, in response to hearing about Mamdani's plan to end gifted and talented, if they haven't wanted to touch it, or if they have touched it, they've been pretty critical of it, just like we have been. So even I found an article from Vox written recently. They wrote an article opposing Mamdani's plan to end gifted and talented, and for some of the reasons that you're naming here, like they shouldn't be putting diversity goals or equity goals above educational achievement, and that this is going to hurt gifted students, and that tracking or grouping students by ability has been shown to help students, all students, even students who are high achieving. They don't fundamentally disagree with, this kind of egalitarian ideal that Mamdani has, but they do name in the article that it gives progressivism a really bad perception. They bring up how, Democrats have been losing their reputation on education recently. They probably feel threatened about school choice efforts across the country, and that it makes them look bad. It makes them look like they want to hurt the gifted students, and for no real benefit to the students they're allegedly, caring about. And they end up agreeing with his, egalitarian equity goals, just they want to use different means to get there. So in this article, Eric Levitz, he says we can still address the achievement gap, but we should do it economically. We should not distribute wealth so wildly unequally, since the only reason these kids are gifted in the first place is that they have wealthy parents. If we just redistribute wealth and income, we can get the same goal without the bad perception.
Yeah, and the reason I read that Vox article too, and the only reason they care about the negative perception is because of the way they think it will undermine their own egalitarian goals. They basically say if wealthy parents see that their children are losing these opportunities, they'll move out of the school district, or they'll just move into private schools. And then, but especially if they move from the district, they will then lose their tax revenue, and then they won't be able to redistribute wealth from the wealthy to the people who don't have the wealth. So it's still on that same basic egalitarian premise. It's kind of a more old-fashioned version of it, the kind of old school, old left idea that what matters is inequality of class as opposed to inequality of race. But And and there's ways in which that, as Ayn Rand pointed out, there's ways in which that old left perspective has more of a patina of intellectualism because it's universalist. It doesn't matter what your background is. It's the people of the same class have united interests, etc. But because that egalitarianism is still at the heart of it, and it's that egalitarianism is fundamentally not driven by any high ideal, but by a kind of resentment. It shouldn't be a surprise that that old left version is now losing, and that the kind of core resentment of egalitarianism is what wins out over the kind of universalistic class struggle ideal of the Marxists. It's funny to say it, but like calling Mamdani and his policies here Marxist is a bit too much of a compliment. That like it's worse than Marxism. It is contemporary racist egalitarianism, where all that matters is the color of people's skin and resentment among the different allegedly racial groups.
Right. And part of what's noteworthy about the response is just how different in posture it is compared to like 2019 when Bill de Blasio was first, talking about phasing out the gifted and talented program. Like you can see a huge difference between then and now. Like it really feels like that's on the downswing, and the right's response, it has the flavor of having the moral high ground, at least on gifted and talented. Like they write very morally impassioned. You're hurting the gifted kids. It's callous. It's monstrous. They really have this flavor of being on the right side. Much more confidence than they tend to have opposing the left.
I think you're right in the main, but you see peeking out from the dirty corners of some of these right-leaning publications the same kind of concessions to egalitarianism. So the City Journal article that by the Manhattan Institute, which is critical of what Mamdani wants to do. One of the arguments that they trot out is that gifted and talented helps reduce, in effect, racial inequality, because it helps lower income Black and Hispanic students gain more than they would have without it, which may well be true, but is that the reason that we should care about it? That it's helping people on the basis of their background, or is it that it helps high potential individuals, whatever their background is? Same thing that the New York Post does. It makes that same perception argument that Vox did, that if wealthy people leave the district, they won't be able to, soap the rich anymore and fund the New York City school district.
Yeah, it's interesting to compare the reactions to Mamdani's other education proposal, universal childcare, because on this proposal, the left, they celebrate it, they laud it. It's, it really has the perception of lifting up the poor, and then the right really has very little to say. I mean, these proposals get pushed every now and again by different politicians, and the right's general response is, let's do a pale imitation. Like, why don't we give money to parents directly so that the moms can stay home, because they would prefer moms stay home with their kids rather than sending their children to daycare. But there's no like real principles that they're using to oppose universal childcare. And so I want to turn to some of the premises in this debate on education specifically, and analyze them. So on all sides, you'll often see this discussion about gifted education, where people are conceding that the gifted education is a better or a higher quality education because it's gifted, because it's accelerated. And so for those who want to end the gifted program, you'll hear, it's not fair that these children from wealthy families get to have a better education, get to have a higher quality education than students in the general classroom. And it's simply not true that an accelerated or gifted program is the same as it being better. If you're a kid who doesn't have the prerequisites, who can't learn at the accelerated pace that the gifted program is offering, it would not be better for you to be in that classroom. It would be a dramatically worse educational experience for you to be in a classroom that's pushing you beyond, like far beyond what you're capable of. I mean, it makes sense, right? Like if I was not a very good math student, if you just plucked me in a calculus class, like I would not have thrived. It would have been a much worse experience than a class that was suited to my needs. What makes an education good for a student is that it's tailored to where they're at and it's helping you grow with where you're at. Now, it's likely true that the general education classroom is too slow. That for most of the kids that are in the classroom, it could be faster, it could be more accelerated, it could be more in depth. I think that's probably true. But that's not the same as saying just an accelerated education is a better or a higher quality education. For the kids who can't match the pace, it's not. A similar issue that keeps coming up is this idea that an education is zero sum, that if a student is ahead, they are taking something from the student who is struggling or who is behind. But education is not zero sum. It does not hurt another child if some other student in the class is at a more advanced state. It does not take anything away from them, and preventing that child from advancing doesn't gain the child who's struggling anything. Obviously, if the child is struggling, that's bad for them. But the solution to that is to give them a better education, help them achieve, help them grow, challenge them where they're at. If you actually care about the students who are struggling, then you would be thinking about how to help them. You wouldn't be thinking about how to knock down some other child who's quote unquote ahead. Now, it's complicated by the fact that this is in a public school system context. So some will argue, that the gifted and talented schools or the gifted and talented students, they're getting extra resources, and that's not fair. And in a certain sense, it's zero sum in that way. But if you actually look at how New York City public schools, they have a school budget sheet that you can look up, and you can look up any school in the district and see how it's funded and compare it to the average in New York City. And on average, the gifted and talented schools are funded less, indeed 40%, around 40% less per student than the general education schools, because New York City has its own already equity kind of weighting practices, how they fund the schools based on different categories of need. And so if anything, if the school system in New York is rigged in favor of anybody, it's rigged in favor of the poor. It's rigged in favor of special education. It is not rigged in favor or zero sum in favor of the gifted students.
Yeah, I think you make a good point, especially about the role of public education in distorting people's thinking about this. Because of the fact that public education is funded by tax dollars. Like even if it's true that per school, gifted schools receive less money than your average school in New York, somebody could still reasonably complain, why are my tax dollars going to this gifted program at all? When my kids, let's say, for whatever reason, aren't gifted, or I don't want them in that program, why should I have to pay for that? And that does make it seem like somebody's gain, even if it's only a marginal gain, is somebody else's loss. And I mean, I think what this really brings out is, at core, you can't settle this controversy or this dispute without taking it outside of the context of public education system. You inevitably will have certain kinds of sacrifices of certain people to other people, as long as it's being funded through taxes, as opposed to in a private market, for a private free market education, where you pay for what you get, and it's your choice whether you want to pay it and whether what you're going to get is worth paying for. And I mean, the broader issue here is the overall connection between not just economic, but all forms of political freedom, the connection between that and the importance of respecting ability. So the opposite of a free market system is a statist system, like what we have currently in public education. And Statism is the ultimate tool of the egalitarian, of the thinker who feels resentment for other people of greater ability and wants, for one reason or another, to tear them down. Statism gives them that ability. It gives them the force of the state that they need to help tear people down, to help eliminate the reminders that somebody out there is better in some respect than you are. And so if you revere ability of all kinds, whether innate or otherwise, you need to deprive the resentful of the use of that tool. That means you need to take away the power of the state from something like the market for education, where there are a lot of people who resent those who have greater ability than theirs, and who then use this tool to try to tear people down. So uh, it's if all education were private, you wouldn't have that opportunity. If all education were private, parents would be able to choose exactly how much they want to spend on their children's education. Nobody would be able to take it away from them. Uh, and if they end up, let's say, paying more because they want to send their kids to a gifted program, they'll be able to do that. Nobody will be able to take that away from them. And it'll be their cost to bear. Nobody will be able to complain, you're taking resources away from me. And the point here is not to make some kind of unqualified endorsement of the idea of separate gifted education programs, because this is something that education theorists and practitioners need to work on to figure out. Like, maybe there are contexts in which gifted people actually do better working with less gifted people, because they become the leaders and they become, in effect, the educators for the people of lesser abilities, and that's a form of acceleration for them. And sometimes Montessori works this way by putting children in mixed age classrooms. But the point is not we must segregate gifted from non-gifted. The point is that's something that has to be figured out. It's a problem to solve in educational theory. It's only going to be able to be solved by practitioners who are in the field trying different models out, who are free to try these models out, where parents are free to pay for their children to be involved in one model or another, and to move from school to school to see what works best for their student. And part of the reason this is not all about just segregate the gifted from the non-gifted, is that the broader issue here is not even that the gifted are the only ones who count, though they are very important. I mean, ability is what drives humanity forward. But usually the way gifted programs are set up, they take an intelligence test when they're very young, and they track them on that basis. And while native intelligence is really important, it's certainly not all that matters for someone's ability. And there are people with average intelligence who go on to do great things just because they engage in great effort. And that is all the more reason why there needs to be educational freedom, why there needs to be a free market in education. Because if someone who, let's say, is of average intellectual ability, but who is willing to work hard to learn what they need to learn to do great things, they need the freedom to do that. And children of even just average ability could do much greater things if their parents were free to pay to send them to the kind of school that they need to get the extra education, where they're going to put in the extra work to do that, as opposed to where parents have to pay property taxes that fund some other student's education. Then that makes it even more expensive for them to send their kids to a private school. So the point here is not that only children of ability matter. It's the point that the point is not that only children of native intelligence ability matter. The point is that anyone who wants to exercise and grow the abilities they have needs the freedom to do that. And socialists like Mamdani are trying to take that freedom away.
Yeah, every child deserves to be challenged wherever they're at currently, however fast they can go. Oh, thank you, Ben, for joining me today. For those of you who are watching, some resources you might want to look into to learn more. The best one on egalitarianism by Rand is The Age of Envy, To Confined, and the Return of the Primitive. If you want to learn more about Rand's thought on education more broadly, the best essay there is The Comprachicos, also, and The Return of the Primitive. Thank you guys for listening or watching today. Please subscribe, comment, And if you have any comments or questions, you can send them to newideal@aynrand.org.